Welcome to the debate. Today we are analyzing one of the most visible and contentious expressions of the social contract, the roof over our heads. It's a topic that really sits right at the intersection of architecture, economics, and of course human dignity. When we comb through the global data provided by the OECD, the disparity in how nations handle housing isn't just a matter of slight policy differences. It is a staggering philosophical divide. On one end of the spectrum, you have a country like Colombia, where social housing represents less than 1% of the total housing stock. I mean, it's effectively a rounding error. Then, on the other end, you have the Netherlands, where it accounts for roughly 34%. That is a massive difference. It suggests two completely different ways of answering the question: is housing a commodity to be traded or a utility to be guaranteed?
Should we house people? I think we both agree on that humanitarian baseline. The real question is how. Should public housing be a universal utility, a massive state-owned infrastructure designed to house the majority, what we're calling the universal model we see in places like Singapore, or should it be a residual safety net, a limited, targeted intervention integrated into the private market for those who absolutely cannot survive without it?
To put it bluntly, is it a right for everyone or a ration for the desperate?
That's one way to frame it. And I'm arguing for the latter, what we call the market-integrated or targeted model. I contend that the state is, frankly, a clumsy landlord. Large-scale government blocks often create ghettos, they stigmatize residents, and they consistently fail to maintain quality over time. I believe the better path is using subsidies, like vouchers and mixed-income developments, to integrate people into the private market, rather than segregating them in state-run concrete towers.
And I, of course, take the opposing view. I am arguing for the universal state-led model. I believe the evidence shows that treating housing as a market commodity with a small safety net inevitably fails the vulnerable. When the state acts as the primary developer and landlord at scale, as we see in Vienna or Hong Kong, we don't just solve homelessness, we create stable, integrated communities. The market has never provided for the poor without massive state force, and I intend to prove that today.
I see why you'd aim for that ideal. It sounds orderly, I get that. But historically, the state as landlord model has often resulted in the opposite of stability. It has created physical isolation and fiscal black holes. But let's get into the details, because the history here is fascinating and it's often misunderstood.
Let's dive in. To understand my position, we have to look at what public housing is actually defined as in its most successful iterations. It is a remedy for housing inequality. When you look at the gold standard examples in our material, the success stories are not minor market corrections. They are massive state interventions. Look at Singapore.
Ah, Singapore, yes. The favorite example of urban planners everywhere.
Well, for good reason. I mean, in Singapore, the Housing and Development Board, or HDB, doesn't just manage a few sad units for the poor. Over 90% of the resident population are homeowners through this system. The state controls the supply, the design, and the maintenance. It is the dominant force in the housing market, not the residual one.
But you have to admit, Singapore is a very specific geopolitical context. It's a city-state with a highly centralized government and a unique land ownership structure. Can you really replicate that model in a sprawling, liberal democracy?
You can replicate the mechanism, even if the politics differ. The mechanism is state-controlled supply. Or look at Hong Kong, where nearly half the population lives in public housing. These aren't projects in the American sense. They are the fabric of the city. And this isn't a modern Asian phenomenon only. If we look back at the UK in 1919, the Homes Fit for Heroes campaign proved that the state could step in to ensure dignity where the market provided squalor. The Red Vienna period in the 1920s produced the Gemeindebau, buildings that were, architectural triumphs. My core argument is this: failures in public housing happen when we treat it as a last resort for the desperate. When the state commits to housing as a utility for the many, it works.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the state is the most efficient provider of that dignity. You mentioned the UK's history, the Homes Fit for Heroes, but let's look at the reality of those early interventions. The material points out that the world's first large-scale housing project, the Boundary Estate in London, was built to replace the old nickel slum. Good intentions, absolutely. But slum clearance often meant displacing the very people it was supposed to help.
Displacement is a failure of planning, though, not of the housing model itself.
But the two go hand in hand when you have a centralized bureaucracy making these decisions. Look at the United States experience. We saw a shift from working-class housing to what became these stigmatized superblocks. The material explicitly mentions the welfare queen narrative and the soul-crushing reputation of projects in cities like Chicago and Detroit. These environments became so toxic, so isolated from economic opportunity, that the government's response via Hope 6 was to demolish them. My core argument is that concentrating low-income people in state-owned towers creates isolation. The better path, which we see in the turn to subsidized housing in the U.S., is using Section 8 vouchers or subsidizing private owners. This allows for mobility and integration with the private market.
I think you're conflating concentration with segregation. They aren't the same thing. And this brings us to our first deep dive, the problem of location and the risk of ghettoization. You argue that state housing isolates the poor. I argue that the market naturally isolates the poor, pushing them to the cheapest land. And state housing is the only thing that can integrate them if it's done correctly.
But the evidence of doing it correctly is rare compared to the evidence of failure. Let's look at Brazil, the Minha Casa Minha Vida program. Literally, my house, my life. It was massive, launched in 2009 with a budget of 36 billion reals. They built 4.5 million homes. On paper, that's a triumph for your universal model.
It provided homes for millions who had none. That is a triumph.
It provided roofs, yes. But did it provide a life? Critics in the source material note that these houses were built far from city centers to cut costs. They reduced access to labor markets. If you build a warehouse for people 3 hours from where the jobs are, you aren't solving inequality, you are cementing it. The state looked for the cheapest land, which is always on the periphery, and they dumped 4.5 million units there. That is state-sponsored segregation.
I concede that the Brazilian implementation had locational flaws. However, that was a decision driven by land cost, essentially bowing to market pressures rather than overriding them. Contrast that with Vienna. The Gemeindebau, the municipality buildings, like the famous Karl Marx Hof, are not on the periphery. They are culturally significant architectural icons integrated into the city. They aren't ghettos because they weren't designed for the destitute alone. They're desirable places to live.
Vienna is always the exception that proves the rule, though. Look at France. They built the Villes Nouvelles and the HLM Habitation à Loyer Modéré. The intention was universal access, exactly what you want. But the material describes how this led to suburban ghettos rife with social tension and violence, forcing the government to mandate social mix policies later on. The state created these monocultures of, well, functionally, only the poor ended up living there.
Because they stopped funding them properly and stopped maintaining the social mix. In Singapore, the HDB estates include everything from studio units to executive condominiums. They cater to a massive range of income levels that prevents stigma. The reason the U.S. projects in Chicago or Detroit failed wasn't because the government owned the building. It was because, as the text notes, NIMBYism blocked public housing in the suburbs. The market and private homeowners stopped the state from integrating these developments, forcing them into already low-income neighborhoods. You can't blame the state for a failure caused by the private market's refusal to share space.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered that the state is often a terrible landlord over the long term? This is our second point of contention: maintenance, privatization, and the right to buy. You want the state to own the asset, but bureaucratic budgets fluctuate. Look at Vietnam, the Khu Thap Te, those socialist blocks built from the 60s to the 80s. The text says they became dilapidated specifically due to a lack of municipal funding. When the state runs out of money, the building rots.
And when a private landlord runs out of money, they evict the tenants or sell the building to a developer who demolishes it.
Not necessarily. That's why the UK's right to buy policy was so significant. Introduced by Thatcher, it allowed tenants to move from public tenancy to private ownership. It empowered individuals. It turned a liability into an asset for the family. And it created mixed tenure naturally. I would argue that the U.S. Section 8 program is superior for similar reasons. It utilizes the private market's efficiency. You give a tenant a voucher, and they find a landlord who maintains the property because they have a profit incentive to do so.
But I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because privatization cannibalizes the safety net. Let's look at the actual aftermath of right to buy in the UK. The material explicitly states that the policy, combined with a stop on building, led to a shortage. Now, affordable housing in the UK is just a planning condition, Section 106, rather than a state guarantee. You've traded a permanent asset for a temporary cash infusion, and now you have a crisis.
But the stock that remained public often stayed in poor condition.
Not in Berlin. In fact, the privatization of public housing there is now being reconsidered and regretted in attractive areas. Or look at China. The old public houses faced massive corruption and family disputes when they transitioned to private sales. And regarding your point on Section 8 vouchers in the U.S., the text is very clear on this. It notes that market solutions like Section 8 have long wait times, and crucially, landlords often refuse to accept the vouchers. If the private market can simply say no to your safety net, it's not a safety net, it's a lottery.
It's a lottery, with better outcomes for the winners than being trapped in a decaying tower block. But this brings us to the philosophical core of our disagreement: universal rights versus targeted rations. You view housing as a constitutional right that the state must provide.
Because it is. Look at South Africa. Their constitution explicitly enshrines the right to access adequate housing. Now, I know you'll point to the backlog, 3.7 million units as of 2021. But despite that, the government provides free basic services, water, electricity, to the poor, and has doubled formal households since 1996. That is what happens when you treat housing as a human right rather than a market commodity.
But is it sustainable? The text mentions that the European Commission noted a massive investment gap in social infrastructure, 150 billion euros per year. That is a staggering number. You can write rights on a piece of paper, but you have to pay for the bricks.
You pay for it one way or another. Finland proves this. They adopted a housing-first policy. They prioritized unconditional housing, no jumping through hoops, no market tests. The result? They reduced homelessness by 35% between 2008 and 2019. That requires direct state intervention. You cannot subsidize your way to zero homelessness because the market has no interest in housing the most vulnerable.
Look at Denmark and the Netherlands. They have huge social housing sectors, 20% and 34% respectively. But even Denmark has had to introduce policies to counter ghettoization. They are now favoring employed renters over the unemployed in allocation. Even the universal systems are forced to ration based on economic utility eventually. My argument is that a needs-based approach, rationing resources for those who truly cannot compete in the market, is the only realistic economic model. The advocates' housing for all infrastructure is a utopia that goes bankrupt.
It only goes bankrupt if we refuse to fund it. The text notes that in the UK, during the Labour government of the 60s, they built 1.3 million new homes. It was a choice. The current investment gap in Europe you cited, that's a policy choice to underinvest.
It's a choice based on the reality of limited resources.
Or a choice based on the prioritization of private profit. Let's look at the definitions again. In Vancouver, they changed the definition of social housing to mean rental housing where only 30% of units are for those who can't pay market rent. The market-integrated model you love is slowly defining social housing out of existence.
That's a cynical reading. I see it as integrating the poor into the mainstream rather than segregating them. The U.S. HOPE VI program, despite its flaws and displacement, explicitly aimed to replace blighted superblocks with mixed-income communities. The goal was to break the cycle of concentrated poverty.
And the result, as the text says, was that more housing was demolished than built. That is the legacy of the market-integrated approach, destruction of supply.
Let's pull back and summarize, because we are looking at two different roads to the same destination. I agree that everyone needs a home, but the tower in the park model, the massive state intervention, is obsolete. It is too rigid, too prone to decay, and too isolating. The future lies in what we see in Spain with the VPO, promozione privata, privately developed housing with public subsidies, or the mixed income communities the U.S. is striving for. We need to leverage the private sector's ability to build and maintain while using the state's funds to ensure access.
The state alone creates ghettos. I disagree fundamentally. The market has never, in the history of urbanization, provided for the poor without massive state force. The most successful models in our source material, Singapore, Hong Kong, Vienna, are the ones where the state acts as the primary developer, not just a regulator or a dispenser of coupons. Yes, location matters. The Brazil example proves that bad planning is bad planning, but that is a failure of execution, not the model. When you hand housing over to the market, you get what we see in the UK now: a shortage, high rents, and a safety net that is full of holes.
And yet, even in the Netherlands, with its 34% social housing, or South Africa with its constitutional rights, we see backlogs, waiting lists, and financial strain.
Which brings us to a point of convergence. Whether you prefer the bricks and mortar approach or the voucher approach, the current global investment is insufficient.
That is undeniably true. The European gap of 150 billion euros, the 3.7 million unit backlog in South Africa, the demand is outstripping the supply regardless of the ideology.
Exactly. The UN and South African standards define adequate housing as having services, security, and dignity. Right now, most nations are struggling to meet that, whether they are capitalist, socialist, or somewhere in between.
So we invite you, the listener, to look at your own city. When you look at the skyline, do you see a safety net, or do you see a market that has left people behind?
And do you see a government brave enough to build the foundation for a community, or just one that patches the cracks? Thanks for listening to The Debate.